The pale crawler. Have you ever been so certain of something you saw that no rational explanation could convince you otherwise? That's how I feel about what I encountered in the Blue Ridge Mountains last November. I still wake up in cold sweats, picturing that thing's eyes reflecting the dying light like an animal's. I've been hunting elk in the North Carolina mountains for 15 years. I know these woods, the way they breathe, how the wind moves through the trees, which sound belong and which don't. I prefer solitude when hunting. There's something pure about being self-reliant in the wild. My usual spot is about 30 miles from Asheville, deep in a section where few people venture, especially once snow begins to fall. That November was particularly harsh. The temperature dropped to around minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit at night, and even with proper gear and a well-insulated tent, I felt the bite of it in my bones. I had tracked a small herd of elk through fresh snow, set up camp near a frozen creek, and settled into the rhythm of the hunt. It was the fourth morning when everything changed. I hiked about 2 miles from camp to a ridge overlooking a small valley where I had spotted elk tracks the previous day. As dawn broke and visibility improved, I noticed movement in a clearing below. My first thought was that it might be a wounded animal dragging itself through the snow. I raised my binoculars, and what came into focus chills me to this day. It wasn't an animal, at least not one that should exist in our world. The figure was humanoid, but wrong in every possible way. Completely hairless, its skin so pale it nearly blended with the snow, except for a faint grayish-blue tint. It moved on all fours, but not like a human would crawl. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles, and it navigated the snow with disturbing efficiency. The creature approached what I could now see was a dead rabbit. Without hesitation, it began to tear into it with bare hands and teeth. Despite the freezing temperature, this naked entity showed no signs of discomfort, no shivering, no visible breath in the cold air. For 15 minutes, I watched through my binoculars, thankfully unnoticed as it focused entirely on its meal. When finished, it simply crawled away, disappearing into the dense forest with that same disturbing spider-like movement. I abandoned the hunt that day, returning to camp with my mind racing. Perhaps it was someone with severe mental illness who had somehow survived in the wilderness, but no human could move that way or survive naked in these temperatures. Deep down, I knew I had witnessed something beyond normal explanation. That night in my tent, every crack of a branch outside made me jump. I kept my rifle loaded beside my sleeping bag. The next day, I stayed closer to camp, unwilling to venture too far, but still hoping to salvage my trip. I managed to take down a young elk in the early afternoon, about half a mile from my tent. Field dressing it took longer than expected, and dusk was settling in as I finished. As I approached my campsite, I noticed the entrance flap to my tent was open, though I distinctly remembered closing it. I raised my gun and called out, thinking perhaps another hunter had stumbled upon my camp. No response came. Moving closer and scanning the area, I saw it, the same pale creature from the day before, emerging from my tent on all fours. In the fading light, I could see its features more clearly. Its face was almost human but feral, with eyes that reflected the dying light like an animal's. Our gazes met, and in that moment, I knew what I was encountering wasn't just strange, it was supernatural. Its mouth opened, revealing pointed teeth. I fired a shot reflexively. The creature flinched but didn't flee immediately. Instead, it continued to stare at me for several seconds before crawling backward with that same disturbing movement and disappearing into the underbrush. Inside my tent, everything was as I'd left it except for my sleeping bag. It had been unzipped and laid open, as if prepared for someone or something to crawl inside. I packed up immediately, abandoning some gear in my rush. I hiked through the night to reach my truck, not stopping once. Every time fatigue began to overtake me, the image of that thing's face would flash in my mind, renewing my determination to put as much distance between us as possible. I've tried rationalizing what I saw. Was it a person with some rare condition? Was it something that shouldn't exist in our dimension? The indigenous peoples of the Appalachians have legends of pale, nocturnal creatures that dwell in caves and hunt at night. I dismissed such stories before. I don't anymore. I returned to those mountains this past hunting season, but I chose a different area. Sometimes at night, when I'm on the edge of sleep, I imagine that thing finding my new hunting grounds, crawling toward my tent with unnatural movements, seeking a warm body to replace its cold one. What would you do if you found something like this had crawled into your sleeping bag while you were away? And worse, what if it's still waiting for you to return? Hey there, thanks for watching this story on Dark Tales Vault. If you enjoyed The Pale Crawler, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything, and you be helping me reach my first 100 subscribers. New terrifying tales from the Appalachians are coming your way every week. Sleep tight, and remember, sometimes the things that go bump in the night are actually crawling. Wings of Terror. What if I told you that the skies above the Appalachians hide something that science claims disappeared millions of years ago? Would you believe me? I wouldn't have believed it either until that autumn morning in eastern Tennessee. For over 20 years, my brother Nathan and I have made a tradition of duck hunting together in the wetlands near the Appalachian foothills. Every October, we carve out a few weekends to wade into the marshes with our waders, shotguns, and my chocolate lab, Rusty. Last season, we visited our usual spot at a secluded lake near Johnson City, a place not exactly secret, but enough off the beaten path that we rarely encounter other hunters. That particular morning started perfectly. The sky was clear and ideal for duck hunting. We arrived at our favorite patch of reeds around 5:30 a.m., arranged our decoys in the shallow water, and settled in to wait. Rusty was eager at Nathan's side, occasionally whining as if begging to chase something down. By 7 a.m., we'd spotted several groups of mallards circling overhead. Everything seemed to be shaping up for a successful hunt when a flock of about 15 mallards approached from the north, flying in their typical V formation. We readied our shotguns, waiting for them to come within range. But instead of continuing their descent toward our decoys, the entire flock suddenly dropped, not in the controlled way ducks usually land, but as if they'd been yanked downward by invisible strings. They splashed into the water about 60 yards out and then went strangely still. What the hell was that about? Nathan whispered. I shrugged, suggesting maybe they'd spotted us, but honestly, I'd never seen birds act that way before. We tried making some calls, but the ducks remained motionless on the water surface. From what I could see, they appeared alive and alert, heads swiveling nervously, but they wouldn't budge. Something had spooked them badly. Nathan sent Rusty to flush them out, thinking they might take flight when approached by the dog. But even with Rusty splashing about just feet away, the ducks just paddled in tight circles, refusing to fly. I've never seen anything like this, I told him. In 30 years of duck hunting, I'd seen birds get spooked or too comfortable, even some that seemed to mock our poor decoy arrangements, but never ducks too terrified to fly. These birds would rather face a predator than take to the air again. Nathan stood up, waving his arms and shouting to flush them out. Even that didn't work. The ducks huddled closer together and quacked softly. Then we heard it, a sound that sent instant goosebumps across my skin. An extraordinarily high-pitched screech cut through the air. If it was a bird, it was unlike anything I'd ever heard, and it sounded massive. The cry started similar to a hawk's, but rose in pitch and volume until it seemed to vibrate inside my skull. Rusty whimpered in panic, swimming frantically back to shore. Nathan grabbed him as he emerged from the water, the dog shaking violently. "Dad, what is that?" Nathan asked, his voice uncharacteristically tight. I'd never seen my brother scared like that since we were kids. The sound came again, much louder, from somewhere behind us over the tree line. All three of us turned toward it, and that's when the shadow fell over us. Something massive was moving above the pine trees at the edge of the marsh. My brain struggled to make sense of it. Was it a low-flying plane? A small passenger jet that had strayed off course from the Tri-Cities airport? But planes don't have wings that flap. As it cleared the tree line and soared directly overhead, I felt my heart nearly stop. This wasn't a plane. It was alive, a flying creature the size of a small airliner. Its wingspan must have stretched 70 feet across, if not more. Its body was long and serpentine, covered in what looked like leathery skin that caught the early morning light. The head was all wrong for a bird, elongated like a crocodile's, with a ridge of spines running down its neck and back. It was flying low, about twice the height of the tallest pines, close enough that I could see the texture of its wings and the way its long tail whipped behind it for balance. For a split second, it looked down at us with reptilian eyes that seemed to evaluate us as potential prey. "Run!" I shouted, a primal instinct taking over. We made a mad dash through the marsh, clutching our shotguns to our chests like lifelines. Rusty was ahead of us, making a beeline for the truck. The creature screeched again as it passed overhead, so loud I could see ripples form on the water's surface. It continued eastward over the marsh, eventually disappearing from sight. We reached the truck in record time, piling in with Rusty still dripping wet in the back seat. We sat there breathing hard until Nathan broke the silence. "Tell me what you saw," he demanded, his voice shaking. "That was a damn pterodactyl," I whispered, not believing the words even as they left my mouth. But what else could have been? It was reptilian, massive, and prehistoric in appearance, like something straight out of Jurassic Park soaring over eastern Tennessee. After some debate, we worked up the courage to return for our gear. The ducks that had been paralyzed with fear were gone, apparently brave enough to take to the air once the predator had passed. We found new hunting spots since then. When we see other hunters, we're friendlier than we used to be. Something about being alone out there doesn't feel as appealing anymore. I've researched sightings of large flying creatures in the Appalachians. There are more reports than you might think, dating back to the early settlers. Native American legends speak of thunderbirds and flying lizards that would steal children from villages. Whenever people ask why we don't hunt at our old spot anymore, we make up excuses about poor duck populations. The truth is too unbelievable. But sometimes, when I'm out in open spaces, I find myself scanning the skies. Because if one prehistoric creature survived in these ancient mountains, what else might be out there, watching and waiting? What would you do if you saw the shadow of something impossible passing overhead? Would you run? Or would you look up? The forest warning. Have you ever experienced a moment when reality itself seems to fracture around you? When everything you thought you understood about the world suddenly doesn't apply anymore? I felt that terror, and I still can't explain what happened to us in the Monongahela National Forest. My hunting partner Ryan and I both served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Marines. We bonded over our shared West Virginia roots and kept in touch after getting out 5 years ago. Every November, we take a week away from jobs, families, and the noise of everyday life, becoming just 2 former jarheads tracking deer through the mountains and drinking bourbon by the fire. The quiet of the forest was therapeutic for us. After what we'd seen overseas, ghost stories didn't move the needle much. We'd laugh at local folklore about people going missing in the Monongahela and strange sounds in the night. We'd seen real horror, or so we thought. Last November, we set up camp near the Spruce Knob area, a spot known for good hunting, but also for its share of local legends. A couple of days into our expedition, the weather took an unexpected turn. Light snow had fallen overnight, making tracking easier, but hunting more challenging. We split up mid-morning, planning to circle back to our rendezvous point by early afternoon. I was moving slowly through a dense stand of maples when I saw movement about 80 yards out. Through my rifle scope, expecting to see a buck, what I saw instead made my heart stop. It was a human figure, a man hanging from a large oak tree. I immediately lowered my rifle and moved forward. As I got closer, there was no doubt. It was a man hanging by a rope around his neck, swaying slightly in the breeze. The body appeared weathered, like it had been there for weeks, maybe months. The clothes were in tatters, and the face was unrecognizable from decay and what looked like animal predation. I keyed my walkie-talkie. "Ryan, I need you in my position now." His response was immediate. "What's wrong? What's your location?" "About half a mile northeast of the split. There's "There's a body out here." I gave him more precise directions while keeping my eyes fixed on the hanging figure. Despite the apparent state of decay, there were no birds or insects around the body. In the cold, maybe that wasn't unusual, but even the area around the tree seemed unnaturally quiet. Ryan reached me about 10 minutes later, breathing hard from practically running the whole way. "Jesus Christ," he whispered when he saw it. Our Marine training kicked in. "We need to call this in," he said. I nodded, already pulling out my cell phone. Surprisingly, I had one bar of service. I dialed 911 and waited for it to connect. That's when Ryan grabbed my arm. "Wait, look." I glanced up from my phone. The body was still there, swaying gently like before. I blinked, and the rope was still there, but the body had vanished. "Did you see?" I couldn't finish the sentence. Ryan nodded slowly, his face pale beneath his cold, reddened cheeks. "It's gone. It just disappeared." I looked at the ground below the rope, hoping the body had simply fallen, but there was nothing, not even indentations in the snow where it should have landed. Before the 911 operator came on the line, I hung up. I couldn't form words, couldn't imagine what I would tell them. We stood in stunned silence for several moments, staring at the empty rope still hanging from the branch. "We need to go," Ryan finally said. "Now." At that very instant, a scream tore through the forest, distinctly female, coming from somewhere to our right. Before I could react, another scream answered from the left, then another from behind us. Within seconds, the entire forest erupted with the sounds of female screams coming from every direction. The cries seemed to be everywhere at once, growing louder by the second. Ryan screamed at me to move, and we both took off toward the forest edge, which we knew was about half a mile away. The screaming intensified as we ran, growing louder and more frantic. It reminded me of the aftermath of an IED explosion, that kind of raw, pained screaming that stays with you long after you've left the battlefield. But these were all women's voices, dozens of them, surrounding us entirely. We ran through the forest, barely avoiding fallen logs and underbrush. I held my rifle close, though I knew it wouldn't save us from whatever this was. At a certain point, the screaming was so loud it was almost deafening. I didn't dare turn around or look anywhere but straight ahead. Soon we broke through the tree line into an open field that bordered the forest road where we had parked our truck. The exact moment our boots hit the open ground beyond the tree line, the screaming stopped. It didn't fade or diminish. It just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. Ryan, breathing heavily, looked at me. We turned back toward the forest, which now appeared silent and still, looking as peaceful and ordinary as any Appalachian forest in November. "What the hell was that?" he finally managed. I shook my head. "I don't know, but we're leaving. Now." We packed up our camp in record time and drove 3 hours straight without stopping, talking nonstop about what had happened. We debated different theories. Mass hallucination, some kind of weird acoustic phenomenon in the mountains, even that we'd somehow triggered each other's PTSD. But we both knew what we'd seen and heard. The Monongahela has a long history of disappearances. Native Americans considered certain parts of these mountains to be forbidden territory, places where the veil between worlds was thin. Early settlers reported hearing the cries of women in areas where no women lived. Ryan and I still go hunting together, but we found spots far from the Monongahela. Some nights, though, I still wake up hearing those screams, wondering if they were warnings meant to drive us away, or if they were the voices of those who never made it out of those ancient woods. What would you do if the forest itself seemed to be warning you to leave? Would you listen? Or would curiosity lead you deeper into the trees? The young Sasquatch. What if I told you that the legends whispered about for generations in the Smoky Mountains are more than just campfire tales? Would you believe me if I said I've seen proof with my own eyes? My wife Sarah and I certainly never expected to. We've been hunting in the Tennessee side of the Great Smoky Mountains since before we were married. We've known these ridges and hollows for over 20 years, but this experience from June 2021 changed our understanding of these ancient forests forever. It was unusually hot that year, and we'd spotted a small herd of deer moving through our back property earlier that week. We decided to spend Saturday morning in our tree, stand about 3 miles deep into the national forest that borders our land. We've been up there since before dawn, about 15 feet up in an old oak with good visibility of a small clearing and a game trail. By mid-morning, the woods were quiet except for occasional bird calls, but no deer were moving. The heat was becoming oppressive. Sarah was dozing against the trunk while I kept watch, sipping lukewarm coffee from my thermos. After a while, I saw something odd at the base of a hickory tree about 30 yards ahead. No way, I thought. Is that a bear cub? A cool sight, but one that immediately puts you on alert. Mama bear is never far from her cubs, and you don't want to be between them. I nudged Sarah awake and put my finger to my lips, then pointed. The animal was small, maybe 3 feet tall, crouched down by the base of the tree. As we watched, we soon realized this wasn't a bear at all. It stood on 2 legs for one thing, and its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were much longer than they should be, and its head seemed directly attached to its shoulders with barely any neck. Its body was covered in dark brown hair or fur, not nearly as shaggy as a bear's, but not like any animal I recognized. The hair was shorter on its face, which I could see in profile as it concentrated on whatever it was doing. "Honey, what in God's name is that?" Sarah whispered. I shook my head, not taking my eyes off the creature. It seemed to be playing with the bark on the hickory tree, peeling strips off and examining them before discarding them on the ground. Its movements were precise, unlike a bear cub, more like a child or a young primate. Occasionally it would stop and look around, but it never looked up toward our position. We watched it for several minutes, completely stunned. My rifle was in my lap, but I didn't even think about it. Watching this thing that clearly wasn't human behave in such a human way was astonishing. Sarah finally whispered what we'd both been thinking. "It looks like a young Sasquatch." I would have laughed if I hadn't been thinking the same thing. Everyone in these parts has heard the stories. Everyone knows somebody who claims to have encountered a Bigfoot somewhere in the Appalachians, especially hunters. I'd heard tales about strange footprints or eerie howls in the night, but never thought I'd see something myself. The little creature had just discovered a beetle under a piece of bark. We watched it observe the insect crawling across its palm with obvious curiosity. Then came a sound that made the hair on my neck stand up, a deep, bellowing call that started low and rose to a powerful crescendo. It echoed throughout the entire forest, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods, maybe a quarter mile away. But it carried perfectly through the air, as if it had come from right beside us. The little creature's head snapped up instantly. It dropped the bark and beetle and let out a high-pitched sound in response. Then it took off running on 2 legs, moving remarkably fast toward the source of that call, quickly disappearing into the thick underbrush. Sarah and I sat there dumbfounded. I was grinning despite myself. What an incredible thing to witness. And Sarah gripped my hand hard. "We should probably go, just in case." I realized what she meant. The same way you don't want to be around a mama bear when her cubs are nearby, you definitely don't want to be around whatever had made that bone-shaking call when its young one is about. We gathered our things and climbed down quickly, agreeing as we hiked back that what we'd seen really was a juvenile Sasquatch, and we must have heard its parent calling it home. The Great Smoky Mountains are among the oldest mountains in the world. Their forests are diverse and dense, with countless unexplored hollows and caves. The Cherokee have stories about the moon-eyed people and other strange beings in these mountains that long predate European settlement. Is it so hard to believe that something could have lived alongside us all this time, keeping hidden, watching us as we encroach further into their territory? Sarah and I still hunt those woods, but we're more observant now, and we always leave at the first sign of anything unusual. We've told only our closest friends about what we saw, and most think we're pulling their leg or misidentified some mundane animal. But sometimes, walking our property at dusk, I feel eyes on me from the tree line. Sometimes I hear sounds that aren't quite animal, aren't quite human. And I wonder, is that little one still out there, growing up in these ancient forests? Has it learned to stay hidden from humans like us? Or will some other hunter stumble upon it one day and tell their own unbelievable story? What would you do if you saw such a creature? Would you try to document it, to prove to the world they exist? Or would you do as we did, keep their secret and leave them in peace? Thank you so much for joining me for another terrifying tale here on Dark Tales Vault. I hope the young Sasquatch sent shivers down your spine. If you enjoyed this story from the ancient Appalachian wilderness, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Each new subscriber brings me closer to my goal of reaching my first 100 subscribers, and I can't tell you how much your support means. Stay tuned for more unexplained encounters from the darkest corners of America's oldest mountains. Until next time, remember, not all eyes watching you from the forest belong to animals we know.